Well, hello everyone, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this special seminar. My name is Melinda Hickson. I'm the Director of the Institute of Post-Colonial Studies based here in Naarm or Melbourne. This is our latest in a wonderful series on decolonising truth that has been brought to us particularly by the wonderful efforts of Vanessa Borolski and Laura Castro, who are joining us with us today. As we start, please let me acknowledge country, Aboriginal country, and indeed Indigenous sovereignty across all of the lands from which we are all gathering together to have these discussions today. Today, we have a very timely opportunity to hear about the Solomon Islands, to hear some very substantial discussions about the Solomon Islands at a time when, of course, the Solomons are very much in the focus in Australia, but in very, very constrained ways in our mainstream media. So it's a really terrific opportunity for us to get together and focus on truth-telling, the history of truth-telling and the complex context of this work. I'm going to hand over now to Vanessa Borolski from the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University, who's going to introduce the seminar and today's panel of speakers. So thanks very much. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thanks very much, Melinda. So welcome to the third of our seminar series on international experiences of truth-telling, which, as Melinda has said, has been hosted by the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization and the Institute for Post-Colonial Studies. I'm really glad you could join us today, and I'm sure it will be a really interesting and stimulating discussion, and particularly in the light of the way in which Solomon Islands has been framed in public discussion, I think in Australian discourse at the moment in quite simplistic terms. So I think this will be a great opportunity to do a bit more of a deep dive into understanding the context in the Solomon Islands and the role of the truth process in relation to that. So I'd just like to start by acknowledging as well the traditional owners of the land on which I'm located, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. I recognise their continuing connection to the land and waters and thank them for protecting this country and the extraordinary gift which this protection provides for us all. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations peoples present today. I recognise that they have never ceded sovereignty, and I recognise my own position as a settler migrant. So just to give you a bit of background to the seminar series before we start with our wonderful speakers, the Alfred Deakin Institute and the Institute of Post-Colonial Studies have been running a series of seminars about truth-telling to try and engage with and respond to the call for truth-telling that's been articulated most recently in the Uluru Statement, but which I think has been a long expressed desire, particularly by First Nation communities in Australia. So if you're interested in some of those previous discussions, all the recordings are available on the IPCS website, so you can have a look at those. In the seminar series, what we wanted to try and do was create a space for an in-depth conversation about both the possibilities and the challenges of truth-telling. We began initially by bringing together Australian scholars who'd grappled with the difficult questions around Australia's colonial history and its contemporary legacy. And then last year, we held seminars on international truth processes in Colombia and Timor-Leste. We also hope to hold seminars on the quite seminal South African truth process in the near future, and also on initiatives around truth-telling in the US. So please look out for information around those two seminars. What we also wanted to do was link the kind of unfolding national conversation around truth-telling to the conversations that have been happening around the question of decolonization, and to ask what would a decolonial truth process look like? Does this concern new methodologies and processes, or does it concern an aspiration for a decolonial future, or does it concern both? Too often, I think what has happened is that truth-telling processes have focused very much on recognition and reconciliation, which are obviously critically important, but sometimes to the detriment of meaningful engagement with questions of reparations and redress. And in some instances have actually ended up undermining Indigenous sovereignty. And some Canadian academics and activists would argue that in that context. So the question is, how do we design truth processes that recognize colonial violation in a way that leads to meaningful redress of power imbalances and which builds sovereignty, self-determination, and genuine relationships of equality? So this is only one of many challenging questions related to the decolonization of truth-telling, which we've been trying to at least touch on in some of these seminars that we've been holding over the past year or two. There have been a number of truth commissions since the 1980s, over 30, between 30 or 40. And I think it's worth asking why these processes remain. Sorry, is there? Okay, so I can hear there's an echo, but I'll continue. So it's worth asking why these processes remain so compelling, despite ongoing critiques of truth-telling processes around the world. How can we understand the hope which has been invested in truth processes to transform societies? And I think we see that kind of hope also invested in Australia's deepening engagement with processes of truth, as well as the way in which the promise of truth is shaped both implicitly and explicitly by international experiences. Hence, our interest and focus on international experiences such as that in the Solomon Islands. So in this context, we've wanted to explore how we can draw from the rich experience and often hard-won insights of truth processes in other parts of the world to enrich the process here. Not with the intention of looking for generic models or easy lessons that can be transposed from one context to another, but the kind of insight which I think can only come from deep and sustained listening to the experiences of others. And that's what we're hoping to do in these seminars. So I think this event is very significant because it focuses on the first truth-telling process to occur in the Pacific region. As we've mentioned, Australia has a long and complex and often neo-colonial relationship to the Pacific region, as you know, evident in current local news headlines. So I think it's particularly apposite that in this context, we reflect on what we can actually learn from the Solomon Islands and the implications of the truth process in that country for discussions of truth-telling in the Australian context. So today we're honoured to have with us three exceptional speakers who have deep knowledge of the truth process in the Solomon Islands. They'll be able to bring you insights from a variety of different perspectives of the truth process and about the country itself. The way we'll run is that each speaker will give a brief input of approximately 10 minutes, discussing, among other things, their own experience and understanding the Solomon Islands truth process. And then after that, we'll have approximately 40 to 50 minutes for discussion and questions to draw out some of the details and complexities. So you're welcome to post questions in the Q&A box or make comments in the chat during the presentations. And after the presentations, you can raise your hand virtually and we'll come to you to ask your question, or we'll read out your questions in the chat if you prefer that. So please try and remember to mute yourselves so that we don't have unwelcome background noise. And then I'll just very briefly introduce the speakers and then we can start hearing from them. Sophia Matcher is former Deputy Chair of the Solomon Islands Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a prominent human rights activist from Peru, where she served as a commissioner on Peru's Truth and Reconciliation Commission between 2001 and 2003. She has subsequently been a UN consultant for transitional justice processes in Libya, Yemen, Tunisia, Colombia, and has also served as the president of the Reparations Council in Peru from 2006 to 2014. Joseph Buccona is a Solomon Islander law and history scholar and is now an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He completed a PhD at the Australian National University, focusing on land, law, and history. And in 2003, he worked with the Solomon Islands Christian Association Peace Office as the coordinator of Truth and Reconciliation Consultation Dialogue. He's also worked with the Solomon Islands government on law reform, land, natural resources, and governance projects. Daniela Gavshon is the program director of the Public Interest Advocacy Center's Truth and Accountability program and designs and leads the organization's transitional justice work. Prior to joining the PIAC, Daniela ran the International Center for Transitional Justice's program in the Solomon Islands. In this role, she provided extensive advice and support to the Solomon Islands Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including leading a process for a women's submission to the Truth Commission. So I think you can see that we've got three really amazing speakers. I'll hand over to you, Sophia. Thanks.
Vanessa, it looks like we may have momentarily lost Sophia. She is a bit concerned about her. Oh no, she's back.
Hi, Sophia.
Okay, I'm here. I'll start.
Are you ready to go?
Okay, sorry. I will share my I have a presentation. Okay?
Sure, we can see it. Thanks.
Excellent. Okay, I thank you for the invitation. I'm so happy to talk about the experience in the Solomon. And it's good. You're listening to me? It's okay?
We can hear you. Thanks.
Okay. The Solomon Island was created by the Act, and the mandate we received was examining the truth about human rights violation between the 1st January 1998 until the 23 July 2003, and to see to root causes, responsibility, the impacts. Also promoting reconciliation, restore the dignity of victims, submitting report providing an impartial historical records and recommendation helping to prevent repetitions. We were 5 commissioners, 3 Solomon Island and 2 international. We spent 2 years in this process, and we received a financial support from the UNDP. We were 176 staff in the TRC. We have a office in Honiara, and 99% of the staff were from Solomon Island, and this is very important because those are national process. And it's interesting. I want to share that when we start with the recruitment, the commissioner decided to have 50% women and 50% men for the staff. And when we organized the first recruitment of the campaigners, who we explain what is the TRC around the country, the result of this first recruitment was 90% was men and only a few females. So when we start to recruit the statement takers, we split the recruitment, the process, and we organize a process only to contract the women statement takers and another different process to contract the men statement taker. And this is the way that we face this unbalance in it's not only in the TRC, I think in in all the country at that time. I don't know now. So it was a big issue, and but was very important that we really have this 50% of women as statement takers, because at the end was the most efficient to take statements, and we collect almost 4,000 statements during the TRC process. This is our final report. We wrote 5 volumes. Of course, what you see in this picture is not the real publishing in Solomon Island. I did this in my home, so I put my own. I print and put as books, but we presented the final reports to the Prime Minister Gordon Darcy Lillo in January 2012. The Prime Minister never presented the report to the Parliament. The report was silenced until now, and the next year will be 10 years after the presentation. So when this DRC is important, no? When we start to work in the TRC about the internal conflict, it's amazing that the majority of the publication about the conflict was written by foreigners, so no by Solomon Islanders. And for me, the TRC final report is a modest contribution to the history from the conflict, writing by Solomon Islanders, most of them young professional Solomon Islanders who work at that time in the TRC producing this report. And so I think this is very, very relevant. And I'm convinced that this report can contribute to build a collective memory about the conflict, and it's possible with this to open a national dialogue about how they understand the conflict, why this happened, and what reforms we should do or we should build in Solomon Island. But the TRC for me open a new moment, and this is because this is a process to open public scenario to victims. But for sure, this process is not enough to change culture, to change inequality, and especially to change power in the country. But I think it's a special moment that you open the windows or open the public scenario to listen the people who suffer during the conflict. So in general, if you want to continue with this process after the TRC, the local civil society for sure are the best actors to really push this process forward and try to make some change. But you don't need, it's not possible to expect that the government will do that. It's the local civil society. So the new time when you listen different voices, is possible. This moment is possible to rewrite the history and to change the hegemonic history that was created by the people who are in power. And I will say what Benjamin says about the present. No, he says the present is like a light, and came and passed quickly, fast, and they can only retain in our as an image. And after this, we give a meaning of this present who passed so fast. And this meaning is doing by say from the power, from a particular approach. And this is what happened when you write the history, official history in a country. So, but if there is a meaning, the rationality is that you can change all the time. If you can change the frame, and you can reinterpret the history and change, and change what you should change in the past. So I think that is what the Truth Commission to the truth telling is the magic of the truth telling. You can change what happened. You can give another meaning of what happened in the past. Also, I will say also about the statements. The statement is in the central of the tool to give the voice to the victims, and the statements are more than narrative of events. The statement tell us how these events affected the people life. They tell us about judgment. They tell about the power relation in the society. That's why it's so particular, relevant in all this process of truth telling, that the people tell what happened during the conflict. And very fast, I will read some statement who was giving during the public hearing, how they understand it, how they explain the internal conflict. A ex-combat from Guadalcanal says, one of the main aspects inside the bona fide demands, which is the land. Our land had been taken by government, filed without proper consultation with the rightful tribe from Guadalcanal, especially the crown land where Honiara city is located. Another ex-combatant says, looking back on the past time, some causes of detention started during those days when our forefathers sold this land according to their own decision without consulting their tribe and others who were alive at that time. When time went on, people started to claim back the lands because they knew of their right over these areas, and it causes a lot of misunderstanding among the people concerned. Ethnic tension was not caused by militants, but ourselves. So he opened a new way to understand the ethnic tension. And the militant ex-combatant says, also in public hearings, the root of the ethnic crisis, Solomon Island was a British protectorate. During those days, we were so very primitive, uneducated, and they colonized our island. All the colonizer must have understood that we did not have any say in drawing these boundaries. These political boundaries and borders were drawn up by our former colonizers. They were cross-sectioned culture where bridges, people from this side of the other border could not cross the border to the other side. Why? This was not our way of life. The system and the culture and their conscientiousness were new to us. And this is that the people, the combatants who took the arms, speak to the country, no? And in relation of the ethnic tension, the conclusion for the final report, the conclusion 5 and 6, says the internal armed conflict began with the forced displacement for thousands of settlers in part of Guadalcanal. The conflict moved throughout different stages. The first stage included the eviction of settlers, mostly militant, from Guadalcanal by the Guadalcanal Revolutionary Army, and later with the name of Isatabul Freedom Movement, and the retaliation of the militants' Eagle Force. The definition of the conflict as ethnic tension, which has been popularized to describe the whole period between 1998 and 2003, strictly speaking, applies only to the first stage. I think I highlight this conclusion because it's wrong to try to find the explanation of what happened during the conflict, the violence years in Solomon Island only in the ethnic tension. There are other problems around the country who need to be faced. I'm finished very quickly now. I will only read some small speeches from victims. The Guadalcanal Revolutionary Army came to the farm and searched for Malaitans. We were confused and did not know what to do. A person holding a gun and demanding people leave. It was a chaotic time in the history of the Solomon Islands, where law and order was crippled and our country was ruled by the barrel of guns. I would like to call on those men who had done this to us, that the incident is like a scar inside of me. Personally for me, I would like to say to the people who did this to us that I have the heart to forgive them for what they have done. I want the government to compensate us, those of us who lost our properties. The ethnic tension really troubled us. And this is very interesting what Miss Mary says. I am part of Malaita. I was born and brought up on Guadalcanal and do not regard myself as a Malaita. My mother is from Guadalcanal and I do not want to go to Malaita. We returned to Honiara. It was, and this is another note, it was not the militant who carried out criminal acts and put the focus in another place, this Mr. Catering, but the police officer. So please have a look at the system and try to correct. I should say the life now is not as good as before detention, for Mr. Sharon, Betsy says. And I will finish with, well, almost finished. We organize also a publishing with the Jews, and this is really what they say was really interesting. One question I would like to pursue is why other Malaitans try to threaten other Malaitans. My parents started to make gardens on Tangarare. When they did that, they were questioned by our Malaitan relative. We were treated the same as the Guadalcanal people at the Tangarare, so they present another complexity of the problem. I had to go through a different stage of my life. The rest of my brothers and sisters could not attend school because there was no money. Almost of the male students wanted to become militants. Once again, leaders of this country, says Samani, we the Jews depend on you to show good examples. Introduce youth development program down at the community level, says. So, and the last, I finish here. At the end, the root causes for the final report in the TRC final report says, first, the hybridization of pre-colonial forms of social organization. The second, the legacy of colonial domination, little room to indigenous participation. Three, a decolonization process placed as a Western model. Fourth, Westminster model despite widespread demand for alternative system of government. Fifth, uneven distribution of development after independence. Six, uncontrolled internal migration. And seven, a sequence of national governments unable to promote national building. Also, to confronting these the truth for a better Solomon Island. We need to still work in this in Solomon Island. Thank you. I finished.
Thank you very much, Sophia. That was fascinating. Should we go on to you, Joseph, now?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'd like to thank the the organizers of this webinar for inviting me to be part of the discussion. The first thing I'd like to mention is that the process of colonization in the Solomons, as well as in other parts of Melanesia, is incomplete, or it's partial. And I say this because when the British declared the Solomons as a protectorate in 1893, they introduced a system of government, which is the Westminster system, with a centralized authority that tried to bring together people of different cultures and ethnic backgrounds to become part of a single entity or nation state. And the centralized authority, for the last 44 years, supports its existence through centralized revenue that is generated through natural resource extraction, such as logging and mining activities. And interestingly, most of these activities are in the customary domain. So in the Solomons, about 87% of the land territory is in the customary domain. Now, related to the establishment of this nation-state construction, was the construction of this idea of a national consciousness. The expectation that all the peoples from the various islands who belong to diverse cultures, ethnic groups, and communities would come together and form a single political entity, which we know today as the nation state. Now, the idea that the establishment of a nation state or the construction of a nation state would lead to national consciousness is an ongoing challenge in Solomon Islands, and I'm sure in other Melanesian countries as well. And this is a region that in the literature is described as the arc of instability or failed states, and it's partly because of this ongoing struggle of the interface between the construction of a nation state and also this whole idea of national consciousness or national identity. So social groups continue to exist and function independently of or with loose connections to the state. So consequently, the process of nation making is an ongoing engagement in the Solomons and also elsewhere in the Pacific or Melanesia, and that makes governance a ongoing challenge. And I sort of talk about this because some of the factors that triggered or contributed to the conflict between 1998 and between 1998 and 2003 what to do with governance as well as socioeconomic issues. And these factors are part of a complex web of interrelated issues that include land alienation, rapid urban migration, increasing informal settlements in and around Honiara. So since 2000 up to now, there is an increase in terms of informal settlements in and around Honiara. And we have a fast-growing population, especially the youth, and also slow economic growth as well. So the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission really was an attempt to sort of address the causes of the conflict and provide recommendation that would be provide the direction in terms of sustainable peace. And as Sophie has mentioned, it's one of the core mandate is around promoting national unity and reconciliation by engaging various stakeholders to be involved as part of the process. So as Sophia mentioned, 2 years the Commission has been facilitating a process of truth telling, and this process was seen as important because it sort of would secure reconciliation and facilitate peaceful settlement. Now, interestingly, the focus of the sort of the process is around sort of victims and perpetrators in terms of direct confrontation between the period from 1998 and 2003, with sort of limited focus on other kinds of traumas that are being generated. For instance, traumas generated due to state capture, or traumas generated due to displacement, or traumas generated due to land alienation. And just by looking at the report, it is not clear whether this process of truth telling recognizes cultural protocols as well as accommodates or respects, provides respect for customers as part of the process. Again, as Sophia mentioned, the Commission produced a 5-volume report, which I don't think many Solomon Islanders have read that 5-volume report. And then also, successive governments have never, paid attention to the content of those reports. And, they haven't formally released the report. The reports were actually leaked by one of the editors of the report. And, Parliament has never discussed the report, although there's a requirement by law that after the Commission produces the report, it has to be debated by Parliament, and that has never been done since 2012. So up to now, or since 2012 up to now, there is no clear strategic direction at the political level for addressing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations. However, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, provides a comprehensive account of the causes as well as the impacts of the conflict, between 1998 and 2003, especially the experiences of the victims and perpetrators. Interestingly, the framing of the perpetrators. So perpetrators are generally framed as the combatants or the militants, although there's talk on the street that there are also other fish that are part of the conflict, or in other words, national leaders or politicians that are also involved as part of the conflict. So the state and its agents, including politicians, are sort of not portrayed as perpetrators. and the report sort of captures the voices of militants, combatants, or combatants and victims. And interestingly, the commission has made a number of recommendations, and in the volume, it's sort of divided into two parts. So part one sort of addresses the needs of victims. So this is where there's talk about enactment of a reparation legislation, and the establishment of a reparation commission, and recommendations to do with exhumation. And also, under part one, there's also a recommendation concerning dealing with vulnerable population, such as women and youths. Third, former combatants. There's recommendation how to deal with former combatants in terms of rehabilitation, and dealing with conflict trials. And then fourth, as part of the part one of the report, reconciliation processes, sort of national healing and reconciliation. And then part two of the report, of the 5-volume report, part two, sort of focuses on institutional reform. So things like the federal system, tribal integrity should be restored as part of a constitutional process. The safeguard in terms of fundamental rights, return of alienated land, customary land recording and registration, justice, as well as security as well. So interestingly, there was recommendation that there should be provision for reforming the police, as well as Ramsey and the government must develop a clear strategy, because when the report came out, Ramsey was all at the end of its regional assistant mission, and part of that sort of fed into the signing of a treaty between Australia and Solomons in 2017. And then the other part, other recommendation on the part two of the report is dealing with historical outstanding issues. So although the reports or the report was never discussed in Parliament, when Sogavare became Prime Minister in 2014, his government came up with a action plan to look at the recommendations and try to prioritize the different recommendations on the reports. So it was an action plan from 2017 to 2020. So trying looking at how to prioritize the different recommendations in the report. So while it's true that Parliament is yet to discuss the report or the recommendations, line ministries have started implementing different aspects of the report. So example, in terms of corruption, there was a passing of the corruption legislation. In terms of security, there was a signing of the security agreement with Australia in 2017. So those are all part of the recommendations made by the Commission. So line ministries have been working on trying to implement some of the recommendations. Now, interestingly, just based on observation, many of the recommendations in the TRC report have a state-centric tone, with an emphasis on addressing structural issues or structural problems associated with governance and socioeconomic development issues. Now, there has been, a number of reconciliations happening outside the state domain. So, faith-based groups have been conducting reconciliation, and apart from sort of the state-sponsored reconciliation process. But despite some of these achievements, and it's obvious that reconciliations will continue for many years to come, and it's important that as part of decolonizing truth, or the process of how do we decolonize truth telling, it's important that culture and custom are factored in, or are featured as part of the process, and that truth telling is of course an important aspect that should be used as a variable to secure reconciliation. And one of the strengths of the commission, as I see it, is it lies in the fact that it provides a space for allowing discussions around restoring relationships, and also conversations around how such relationships could or would evolve. Yes, and my final point is as part of this whole discussion around decolonizing truth telling is based on the Solomon Islands context. The conversations around truth, it's important that the conversations around truth telling should recognize the ongoing tensions between the colonial prescribed state and in indigenous expressions of sovereignty. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Joseph. That was really fascinating as well, and gave us an enormous number of insights. Daniela, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi. It's really a pleasure to be here today. So thank you for having me. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm on Bidjigal land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I really appreciate a lot of what you said, Sophia and Joseph, and I'll touch on some of those comments later, because particularly, Joseph, what you were talking about, the centralized nature of the state and truth telling has been a lot of the things that I've thought about post my time working in Solomon Islands. As Sophia said, the report was had done 10 years ago, and it's been a number of years since I worked on the Solomon Islands Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's been a really enjoyable opportunity to reflect on that. I'm preparing for this today. So thank you for that as well, that opportunity. With the overarching theme being about decolonizing truth, I thought the most useful aspects for me to touch on was how the organization I worked for came to be in Solomon Islands, and then what we actually did while we were there. I'll focus more on that second point, but we'll briefly cover the first one, and then I'll end with a few of those reflections that I mentioned. So as was said earlier by Vanessa, while I was in Solomon Islands, I worked for an organization called the International Center for Transitional Justice. And I'm not sure if those of you on the call are familiar with the organization, but I'd say it's probably one of the first and most established transitional organizations globally. And at the time it was 10 years old, so it's probably nearly 20 now, and had programs in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia, and didn't have any programs in the Pacific. But what happened was ICTJ, which is the acronym for the organization, was approached by the Solomon Island government to assist them. So the way it was told to me at the time was that there are a number of different MPs, and there was a ministry at the time for National Unity, Reconciliation and Peace, and the permanent secretary had all done their research about what they thought would be useful and meaningful in the Solomon Islands context, and they decided that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was needed. And they came to ICTJ and said, you're the experts in this area, you've worked on a number of truth commissions globally, will you come and help? And And at that stage, ICTJ decided that the best way to do that would be to set up an office there. So I was the head of office, and my role was essentially to be a conduit or a pathway to ICTJ's team of experts. So there was a number of different people who'd worked on a number of different truth commissions in the organization. And every time there was a question posed or a query, I would go back to those experts and bring that advice together into one and then share it with the commission. I think this point about being invited is important in the context of what we're discussing today. But I do think, obviously, once you're invited in, there's a responsibility to let the local process lead the way. And so that will sort of lead me into now what we actually did there. In the beginning, what we did is we tried to fill gaps. So we tried to do what was needed and what was asked of us as things came up. So in the beginning, it was supporting with the TRC on awareness raising. I think the team before I arrived was involved in organising the T-shirts to be made, which is a very Solomon Islander thing to have a T-shirt made for the given event. And I think in some of Sophia's photos, you saw some TRC T-shirts. But, things like drafting policies, writing options papers on things like the interplay between the tension trials and the TRC. There's a range of different things that we did filling those gaps. And in the beginning, de facto staff members until eventually the TRC was set up and we were much more of a separate entity. And then we looked at what activities we could do to support the actual work of the TRC. One of the things we did early on was realize that the journalists who were reporting on the TRC didn't really understand what the TRC was doing and weren't critical of it and weren't sort of analytical about it. So they were reporting that, there'd be a public hearing, and Sophia showed you the photos of different public hearings. And in those hearings, they would come and they would just print the stories the next day of what people had said, but there was no engagement about what the TRC was and how it was affecting people, or how, what it could be doing better, or what it should be doing differently, or what was working. And so we brought in a journalist who'd worked on other truth commissions before, and we ran a workshop for the journalists in Solomon Islands to help them understand what a TRC was and how they could be involved in it in a deeper way. The other thing which we did, which was sort of one of the more professionally satisfying things that I think I've done, and processes that I've been part of, that I really have to say it was incredibly meaningful. We worked with women to draft a women's submission to the TRC. So we saw that there was a space, and as Sophia said, the commission had tried very hard to bring women involved with 50 to 50 staff, and having specific women's hearings, but there was really felt like there was more space to be filled with women's voices. So just to talk you through a bit how we did it, because I feel like that process was a process that certainly I learned a lot from, and I think was a really, really important model. We met with women across the country and just started forming lists of women who knew what other women experienced or had insights into the experiences of women. So we weren't looking for victims, we weren't looking for survivors. If people happened to have personal stories to share, that was fine, but we were looking for either people who had more of a leadership role, or people who were sort of connectors in the community and really understood what their peers had gone through. So once we sort of created these lists, we started to divide. We realized we had different groups. We had a Honiara group, which sort of was the capital group, a Guadalcanal group, a Malaita group, and a Western group. So we spoke to a number of people and engaged a local consultant, Ruth Maitala, who was the consultant across the whole program. And then we had different consultants, local consultants for each region. So for Honiara, Guadalcanal, Malaita, and Western. We had a different workshop in each place, talking, 2 or 3 days talking about the experiences of women. And then we brought everyone back together for a national workshop. And in that national workshop, we spoke about what were the common themes that people had experienced across the whole country, but then also the localized themes. What were the issues that had come up specifically for women in different parts of the country? And we ultimately, I'm going to hold it up here. Let me know if you can see my screen well enough. This is the submission that they created, and it's called Hiram Come Story Blong Mifela Oketa Mary. And you can see there's a tree there. And and this is sort of what we created from the post-it notes that were shared in the workshop, but it was the orange was the impacts and the violations. And so that was sort of the fire. And as people found that as a violation happened, there was an impact, but as the impact happened, it fueled the fire more and more. And there was this sort of cycle of impact and violation sort of impacting on each other. Then eventually we started talking about the things that, I guess, the effect, so also the tears, what sort of happened to sort of dampen the fire. So it was things like, you know, the organization of women's groups, love for all, courage to stand up to the militants. So all these things the women described as initially their tears, but eventually became the water that put out the fire. And then with that, you saw seeds of growth. So you saw the restoring of relationship, the working for justice. And, you know, these are the sorts of things that grew up out of it. And these here were the root causes. And I think that image was really powerful for people. So it wasn't sort of the intention of the workshop to create this image, but it was what people really held on to and wanted to sort of have that as their visualization. And ultimately, then what we did is from that main workshop, the workshop decided 5 women. They selected 5 women to write bring everything together. And so it was 5 local women that wrote this submission on behalf of everyone. And then we presented it to the TRC. But what we also did, which I think goes to Joseph's point about people being able to read and engage with this material, is we created a pictorial guide. So I actually don't have one of those because they were so popular that I didn't even end up getting a copy of it for myself. But it was basically the entire submission done in images. And that was also, I think, a really powerful thing because it gave people something to walk away with that they could engage with, that they understood and that was their own. I think the thing that for me that I found really valuable about that experience is that I felt like as an external organization, as an international organization, we definitely guided the process, but it really felt like the participants owned that final product. And it felt like the process had meaning for them and they had the role in documenting it and sharing their insights. And that for me was an incredibly profound experience to see that process go through. You know, there are obviously always going to be problems with that process. There was, you know, we were talking to representatives, not individuals. So we had to hope that we had the right representatives and that was an acceptable way to do it, to speak to representatives, not hundreds of survivors. The other massive issue with that is that there was limited psychosocial support in the country. And that was a massive challenge for the Truth Commission, but also was a massive challenge for any work that we did that brought up issues was what is the support that we're providing people. There weren't really referral pathways the way you would hope there to be, and that was very challenging to do that in a way that felt acceptable and comfortable. If I reflect then back on the TRC in itself and its process and our involvement and what we did, I think for me, one of the things that I reflect on most, and I think it's connected to what Joseph was talking about, but also I would say the work that I've done since then, working on other contexts and particularly in the Australian context. But a TRC, the way it was established in Solomon Islands, it was a very centralized structure. It was exactly mimics, as Joseph spoke about, those colonial or, you know, statehood systems which don't necessarily mirror the way people there connect or relate. I think that if I was to reflect on it more, a sort of a decentralized process, and I'm not suggesting that I have the answers for how you would do this, but a more decentralized process would have been one that would have been really important and sort of useful in a country like Solomon Islands. I also think the one big challenge is that truth commissions are time bound. So, you know, any commission of inquiry lasts, or a truth commission will last for a year. Maybe this one lasted for 2. But we know that these processes go for a lot longer. And I think really, especially in a culture like Solomon Islands, I think having that sort of opening the door for truth telling is really what it's the beginning of a process. It's not the end. And so I think if you see it as a 2-year process, again, the model feels like it doesn't entirely fit the context, but if you see it as the beginning of a process that then takes time, I think that probably is something that then more fits the way that you know the local context is. But I think that the other thing as well that I think that worked really well in the Solomon Islands context, and again I think probably Joseph can talk to this as well, is but the role of the church in that there really was there was a peace office in the church. There was there were a lot of representatives there that could talk to their communities and sort of be the people to connect with the work of the Commission and connect with communities. So those are sort of my main thoughts on it, but I'm happy to sort of flick back to you, Vanessa, and answer any questions.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you to all three speakers. I mean, I know I've learned an enormous amount and about the complexity and the nuance of the experience in the Solomon Islands. I'll just open it up to the floor for any questions. Otherwise, I've got a couple that I'd certainly love to ask the speakers myself. Sorry, I'm just opening up my screen so I can see everybody. Yes, I mean, what I got from all of your contributions was the kind of complexity of the legacy of the Commission. And I mean, I was really interested in, Sophia, you talking about the way in which the process was able to complicate and add nuance to the history of the Solomon Islands. And then, Joseph, obviously you were talking very much about the limitations of the process, the way in which it didn't include, integrate cultural norms, the fact that it's never been discussed in Parliament. And I mean, Daniela, I think it was really interesting to hear your perspective on the international, the role of international actors in the process, because I think often there's a sense that international actors come in, take control, and when actually the story is more complex. So maybe just some reflections about the legacy of the process. I mean, the Solomon Islands is at a particular point in its history at the moment, and why has there been so much resistance to actually respond? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around why there's been so much resistance to responding to the process, and the way in which in some senses it's been kind of swept under the carpet, and what you feel has actually its contribution been in over the last 10 years to where Solomon Islands is at the moment, and whether it's contributed to addressing some of the conflicts and the underlying tensions. I know that's a very broad question, but just to get the discussion going. And Joseph, maybe you want to start, and then Sophia and Daniela, if you want to have any thoughts, and then it'll be great to hear from the floor. Sophia, do you want to jump in?
Yes, only because this is really, I'm surprised why Prime Minister Sogavare don't do nothing right now, because we talked with him a long time, and during the TRC, and also he was a victim for the combatants. And really he in my understanding at that time, he was really a compromise with this process, and I don't understand why do nothing with this report. And also another issue is Ramsey. We can talk about Ramsey long time. It's not a different issues, but for example, we need to check and review how the justice that they implant when they arrive in Solomon Island don't follow necessarily the due process. And I think this is a gap, a issue that we need. If you want to check the history, this is one that you can check. How was the implementation of the justice, or they don't respect the trials to young people, no? Young people, yeah, okay. This is one issue. Another that was very interesting also was a vetting process. And also Ramsey put money to pay in advance the retiro of the police officers, and they can finish the work as police officer when they tell the truth what they did during the conflict, and they arrive to the Truth Commission, to the commissioners, and they tell what they did during the conflict, and so they can go out from police. So this is another that this is not common in this process. So I think this is another issue that is nice, good to investigate as a process, different process that we organize in Solomon Island. The statement takers go around the country. We collect statement in all the country, and also the public hearing we organize in all the country. And yes, I'm very, very in agree with Daniela that we probably need more time in order to give to the people all what you collect from them, and they finish this process and nothing happened after. So I think these 10 years after the Truth Commission present the final report, I think it's a good idea to organize something in Solomon Island. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the obvious things about the lack of implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations or the report is the politics matters. Apart from church matters, politics matters, and also networks matter. So that's how I see why there is a reluctance at the national level to implement the TRC report. And some of the politicians are actually implicated or there are allegations of that some of the national leaders had a role in the tensions as well. So if the there's no massaging of the interface between church and politics, it's a challenge to implement the TRC report.
Can I just add to that as well? I completely agree with the points that both have made about politics. I think the other thing as well is that we see when they're in other countries, when there is reluctance to implement recommendations and reports, a lot of that work then is left with civil society to push that through. But also a lot of the time it's the champions of the people who worked in the Truth Commissions. And I think in the Solomon Islands context, you had the unfortunate situation where a number of the people who were commissioners passed away. So you don't have them as champions. And then I think that ends up having a follow-on effect because there's no leadership domestic leadership from the Truth Commission to really be championing that going forward. So I definitely think the political factors are far bigger than that point, but I do think that is a subsidiary point.
And currently now you have some of the former combatants or militants. They are sort of strong supporters of some of the members in parliament now. So you see them,
There's a couple of questions in the chat which I'll try and read out. Joseph mentioned that state agents were omitted from the reports. Is there a sense of mistrust or discrediting of the TRC in public opinion? Because of, I suppose, because of that.
Yeah, I think it's just a reluctance to participate in the process, or there's sort of suspicious, suspiciousness also in the process, and partly also because how the law is framed. There's sort of a strong that in terms of amnesty or immunity, the TRC does not sort of support facilitating sort of or recognizing issues around amnesty. So I guess it's just a maybe suspiciousness in terms of the process, or just a lack of interest to engage.
Yeah, I think that's a criticism that's been made of many truth commissions as well. Melinda asks, can a truth-telling process lead to genuine change if it fails to take account of the larger, incomplete colonial and therefore global processes that Joseph has so compellingly described? It's a big question, Melinda. But I think it's a very important one.
I want to answer what the issue that the TRC mentioned or not the politician, and I think we mentioned, and one big issue, and probably you can understand why they don't present the report to the parliament, is that we put the corruption, how they took the money of the reparation that the Chinese government gave to the government of Solomon Island. They gave $25 million for reparations, and they distribute the money of the reparation to the people who lost properties, hotels and all this, but not the ordinary people. The ordinary people don't receive nothing, and the money was finished. And there is a list, we get a list from the people who receive reparation, a lot of money. And probably this is one of that they don't like the report, no? And Darson Lily stopped this. Probably he was in the list. He received reparation.
Yeah, just to add on to Sophia, the TRC report identifies programs, such as education, business, project, opportunities, counseling, and also reconciliation as the objectives and foundations of any proposal to proposal for sort of rehabilitation program and so on. So that's sort of in the TRC report. Now, interestingly, the issue of rehabilitation has been complicated because between 2015 and 2016, the Solomon Islands government paid monetary compensation to ex-combatants from Malaita and Guadalcanal. Yeah, so it's sort of there's one thing in the report, but in terms of action by government, sometimes it creates a twist.
But Melinda, do you want to ask your question?
And just going to Melinda's question on truth-telling process lead to genuine change. I guess, if this incomplete colonial project is sort of part of the shaping of the the construction of a nation state, it's important that it should be part of a truth-telling process. So the state has to also acknowledge that it's partly because of some of its dealings that has also contributed to, let's say, the perpetuating of land alienation or displacement. Yeah, so the state has to take responsibility in terms of some of the issues, especially to do with land alienation, massive informal settlements, and issues around displacement.
I think that land, for sure, if you talk about what the colonization disrupting the country, when you should face this, probably land is one issue. But I think now there is so many years that I think there is another problems that the society in Solomon Island was created and development, no? And it's not necessary only to go to the colonial time. So for sure land is an issue at that time, and this is a big issue that everybody should face for sure. Another is the model of the government, who also is a big issue, who you need to face now. But in the last years, there is different problems that they need to face. Not only you find the explanation in the colonial time. And for example, for me, corruption is a big issue in the country. Another is the women participation in politics and how they really participate and be part of the parliament, for example. And another issue is what is the role of the church in this in all this situation of the woman in Solomon Island. So there are really probably church you can go together with the colonization time, colonial time. Sorry, my English. But yes, I think part you can find and you should face what the colonial time set in Solomon Island. But the other is now you need to work in the present. What are the problems now? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it seems, as far as I understand, the model in the Solomon Islands was very influenced by the South African model, which I think also had a very kind of narrow focus on victims and perpetrators and didn't deal with the structural issues of apartheid. And I think it seems from what Joseph is saying, that was, one of the limitations of the Solomon Islands process, that it didn't address that broader structural context, which created the conflict that led to the victims and the perpetrators. So you end up, with quite a narrow view of what happened. That's just my take. But we've got another question from the floor, and then I think possibly after that we'll wrap up, because we're getting near to 1:30. Is there an appetite and memory among communities in the Solomons to address the unfinished business from the report, whether to resurrect the report or review the outcomes in the form of commemoration? Is there capacity and leadership among communities for this? So I think it's very much about, you know, what do communities in Solomon Islands feel about the report and its legacy and what still needs to be done.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Kevin. First of all, you know, not many people have seen the report. You know, many people outside of Honiara have seen the report. So you know, there's really currently people have sort of moved on, and they're sort of more focused in terms of their livelihood, and not so much sort of paying attention to the report. What's sort of the general debate really in Honiara and on social media is around the idea of a federal government system, which is part of the recommendation in the report. And you know, there's the discussion around security with the Solomon's recent signing of the security agreement with security treaty with China. Yeah, so there's really no appetite outside of Honiara to sort of resurrect the report.
I think that Caroline Larraud, who is a former commissioner, and she's still there, and sometime I spoke with her, and she think that it's possible to start to follow, to read the recommendation and to organize a process to follow the recommendation, and she was involved in this. But really, I don't know what happened with her and what happened with Sogavare. I don't know, or the civil society. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions, I'll just thank all the participants and the speakers for giving us amazing insight into Solomon Islands and the truth process, despite the complexity and ambiguity maybe of its legacy. I think these are all very useful lessons for Australians to take away in terms of the truth-telling processes that are happening here, to think about some of those questions and concerns. And yes, so I'll leave it at that, and hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, everybody.